Welcome, everyone. Our agenda for tonight will begin with a brief introduction to Zoom, followed by Melody Pannell introducing our topic and guest speakers who will be presenting during this webinar. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by Melody. After the Q&A portion has concluded, I will share a few announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. Then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by Melody. We encourage you to stay for as much of the webinar as you can, but please note that there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zehr Institute website and YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. Just a brief disclaimer, we do have a secure platform, but in case of disruption, do not attempt to exit Zoom. Instead, close your laptop or turn off your device immediately. If this happens, we will resume the webinar again after 10 minutes. For today's webinar, please acquaint yourself with the Q&A button and dialog box that pops up with it. Melody will be using that feature to moderate the Q&A portion after the presentation. You will likely see a raise hand feature. Please do not use that as we will not be able to monitor it during this webinar. If you're having technical issues, please feel free to send a message to me using the chat box. I will be monitoring that during the presentation. Again, please use the Q&A button and dialog box to ask questions of the presenters, and please use the chat feature to ask questions regarding the technology or your viewer experience. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Now I'm going to pass to Melody to introduce our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be here today for our Colorizing Restorative Justice, a virtual writers roundtable. Today, you will have the pleasure of getting to hear from 5 of the 20 authors of this wonderful manuscript, and we will get started with the introductions at this time. Welcome to our time together. Dr. Edward Valandra who was born and raised in the great Sioux Nation, where he served as a legislator and part of the nation's constitutional task force. He is founder of the Community for the Advancement of Native Studies. His research focuses on the revitalization of the Hokšíla, the disciplinary development of Native studies and other areas. He serves as senior editor at Living Justice Press. Dr. Valandra received his PhD from SUNY Buffalo, MA from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and BA from the Minnesota State University, Mankato. Dr. Rochelle Arms is an assistant professor in the sociology department of John Jay College. She previously served as the restorative justice coordinator of the New York Peace Institute. She has worked in collaborative processes and restorative justice projects in India, Argentina, Kentucky, and other areas. Dr. Arms received her PhD from the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution in George Mason University. She has a BA in Religion and Peace Studies from Swarthmore College and an MA in International Relations through a Rotary Peace Fellowship at the University of El Salvador in Argentina. Barbara Sherrod serves as Restorative Practices Program Director for Restorative Response Baltimore. She educates school communities on the use of restorative practices through storytelling circles and transformative coaching. Barbara is an avid reader, writer, and mother of 2. She runs Millennial Mocha Moms, which she began an online space for Black millennial moms. Barbara is currently a doctoral student at Morgan State University, studying urban educational leadership. Dr. Johanna Turner is an assistant professor of restorative justice and peace building at Eastern Mennonite University and the co-director of the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice. She has worked with arts collectives, community organizing groups, and other social movement organizations. With Restorative Justice Fellowship, she founded a youth leadership development project and launched several programs that integrated movement building, peace education, arts and media, and trauma healing. Dr. Turner received her PhD and a graduate certificate in Women's Studies from University of Maryland, as well as a graduate certificate in Urban Youth Ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. Shamika Mattis-Pinyard is a creative writer, organizational strategist, educator, blogger, public speaker, anti-oppression, and trauma-informed trainer from Brooklyn, New York. She was a founding member of Common Justice and served there for 9 years as a restorative justice practitioner. She has also served communities in Philadelphia through prison social work, re-entry support, and children and families advocacy. She is currently a psychotherapist with New York City Affirmative Psychotherapy and is a professor at CUNY and SUNY. Shameeka received her BA from SUNY Binghamton and MSW from the University of Pennsylvania. We welcome all of our contributors to Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities. And we welcome all of our guests today. You are in for a wonderful discussion as we look at colorizing justice and voicing the realities. So this book, again, is made of 20 authors of color in this book, and they raise unsettling issues about restorative justice and restorative justice practices, situated as they are in white supremacist settler societies that sustain deep roots in European invasion and colonizing. The contradiction between restorative practices and Western white supremacist settler societies in which we practice them is inherited. We people of color, indigenous peoples have not created this contradiction. It is there, but we collectively experience the contradiction in ways whites do not. We, the authors, feel an urgency about addressing this contradiction that our white settler colleagues seem not to perceive or express. We also feel urgency about critically informing communities of color and indigenous communities that this contradiction, while not of our own making or choosing, is one we negotiate in restorative justice. Colorizing Restorative Justice centers this contradiction on the restorative justice and restorative practices agenda going forward. We will hear from restorative justice, restorative practice practitioners on today. And so again, welcome to our webinar. Starting first, again, we will hear from Dr. Edward Valandra.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank the Zehr Institute for hosting this webinar and all the participants on there. I see several of my gentle sisters who I've had an opportunity to Zoom otherwise and get together and visit. I guess one of the things that has been asked of us is like the question on why the book, how did it evolve, and what are the goals? Justice Press executive director, Denise Breton, who approached me about people of color, indigenous people, lack of participation, particularly in the voicing of our realities in restorative justice and restorative practice. And so we got to talking about how we can really beat the bushes, if you will, to try to generate some interest. And so that was one issue. And of course, that goes to the other matter of what roles do we have as people of color, indigenous peoples in restorative justice and restorative practice. So as we were talking, I said, well, one of the things that we could possibly do is to go ahead and put out a call and see what happens from that point on. And so we've done that. But again, part of the issues that Living Justice Press was dealing with was they have published books on restorative practices and restorative justices. But until Colorizing Restorative Justice came out, most of the authors were white. And that was becoming somewhat burdensome to, I think, LJP in terms of how they were being perceived then by other communities, particularly communities of color, indigenous peoples. To Living Justice Press's credit, they do have like indigenous, in terms of restorative practices or restorative justice. It was very clear to the executive director that they really needed to step up their game. And so that's when they asked me to come aboard and really brainstorm of how do we get in the field, frontline people of color and indigenous peoples to write about restorative justice. And so that's when we did the call. And we have to understand that, you know, as part of that, I did a lot of literature research on restorative justice and restorative practice. And it was pretty clear that many of the initial writings about restorative justice and restorative practice were predominantly white practitioners or people in the field that have been in there for quite some time. And just hearing some other dialogues, restorative justice practitioners particularly, was a sense that our voices were not
We'll check if the connection is lost or.
Am I back?
I think you're back. Very good.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, so anyway, I did this call, but it was a lot of discussion about where are the people of color and indigenous people in restorative justice. So we did this call to see what would happen. And we had gotten like 62 abstracts from all over, you know, all over the North American continent, particularly Canada and US. And that was a great response. I mean, we didn't expect that. We were wondering just what the response would be to the call on Colorizing Restorative Justice. And of course, then we got all these abstracts. I went through them. There was a committee of about 5 of us, 4 people of color and 1 white person, and we went through all those abstracts and ended up with the 20 that are in the chapter. And so one of the things that I think has come out of that was there are people of color and indigenous people in restorative justice and restorative practices, but many times the voices are marginalized. And this was and CRJ, as we call it, Colorizing Restorative Justice. CRJ then provided that space for people then to write about their experiences, basically, and what are the challenges that they had within restorative justice and restorative practice. So I think that was one of the major goals of the book, was to then have a platform or a space by which people then, particularly people of color who are in the trenches, to write about their experiences. And one thing became very clear as you read the book: there is racism within restorative justice and restorative practice. It's systemic, it's structural, and the panelists you have on and others that aren't on have written very eloquently about that from their own perspectives and experience. So, so the goal, I guess, of the book was to basically say, look, there is people of color in restorative justice and restorative practices, and they are doing great work. They're doing good work, but because of white supremacy and the colonization that we experience, a lot of times it's on the margins. And I know when they talk, they will give an excellent overview of that experience. I mean, when I read all the abstracts and then eventually read all the manuscripts, I was very overwhelmed by the words that they were writing. So, so that's kind of the book and the overview.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Edward Valandra. We are so thankful for this work, and we are looking forward to hearing from our authors now. Our first author is going to be Barbara Sherrod, who is going to speak a little bit about her chapter, Your Silence Will Not Protect You.
Thank you so much, Melody, for that introduction. So good afternoon / evening, everyone. My chapter, as Melody said, is Your Silence Will Not Protect You. I wrote Your Silence Will Not Protect You because I wanted to highlight my experience as a young Black woman who was a circle keeper inside of the education system, specifically here in Baltimore, Maryland, in Baltimore City public schools, as well as county schools. And just noting, one, how a lot of stakeholders perceive restorative justice, restorative practices, but especially Black women and Black children. What I found most peculiar was when I started to get into policy work, and everyone at the table did not look like everyone who right, is being called to sit in circle. And also the intent behind it. It was, if we're gonna name a thing, right, it was very neo-colonial, it still is. And so sitting at this table, and there's not many practitioners of restorative justice, restorative practices sitting at the table, and the few practitioners that are there, there's even fewer of us who are actually Black, Brown, Indigenous. Even the youth representation was a youth who had graduated from the school system 2 years prior. And so while, right, his experience is helpful and valuable, right, the people who should be doing the policy work should be the people who are going to be directly impacted by the policies. And that's not what was happening. And also what I have found was the audacity and mediocrity, right, of folks to come to the table, policy work, and wanting to speak about restorative justice, wanting to speak about restorative practices, and really not understand the relational aspect of it, the communal aspect of it, the spiritual practice of it, not understanding that they were taking a sacred practice for people and weaponizing it, one, towards our children, right? So just another way of trying to co-opt and weaponize how we build community, right? All under the guise of like, oh, well, we're teaching our children pro-social behavior. And that bothered me, right? Because the question that I asked myself, well, what exactly is pro-social behavior, right? And understanding very well that meant, right, that meant assimilating, that meant code switching, where I've been, right, we're working with teachers and they think that it's a good idea, specifically white teachers, that it's a good idea that Black, brown, yellow children are code switching, not understanding the violent history of it or what it means. Also doing the work, being the person boots on the ground, and then turning around and seeing white colleagues being praised, right? Receiving the credit. And while the work is not about the credit, it's something to be said about how easy erasure happens and how Black and brown women specifically are gaslighted into, taking on, especially Black women taking on this this nurturing role of, oh, well, it's fine. This is the work that I'm supposed to be doing. And too many of times the role of martyr or mammy is pushed onto Black women, even in the restorative justice space. And so I really wanted to talk about, what happens when enough Black women, young, right, old, are saying enough, right? Like, if I speak up, right, what's the worst that could happen, right? In the tune of Audre Lorde, like, what happens if I speak up, right? What are the tyrannies that I swallow day in and day out? And so as I was writing my essay, I started to ask those questions to myself constantly. And I also started to make it a point to call out things in those policy meetings, right? We're here to talk about, I noticed that we're here to talk about the school to prison pipeline as well as restorative practices as a possible resolution. However, there's no community aspect piece to that because the community organizations that we know work closely with the school district is not at the table right now. So who is speaking to the way that we're building relationships? And that's nice that you have the PTA, the state president of the PTA Association here, but tell me in which ways have she's connected with the parents who are in Sandtown, who are still, trying to rebuild and heal and work through what's happened after the uprisings of Freddie Gray. And so there was all these things that were missing. And then even talking to Black women who are within partnership or the close organizations with us and, saying, well, this is something that I've said before. And then it's ignored, especially by like white leadership. We'll say like, well, we need to take some time and really build some relationship with the teachers and get them to understand how being circle keeper also means being participant, because too many teachers or too many educators, adults, quite frankly, just want to learn all of the elements and concepts of this work and then just go and try to push it down kids' throats instead of actually trying to understand what this work looks like from and seeing that, and then and seeing that, we were like, okay, well, how do we start to hold space for this? And so we would each one by one at those meetings, we would speak up, right? We're talking about this thing and yet you don't want to talk about race. We're talking about restorative justice, which we can see it traces back to all of these Black, brown, indigenous, yellow communities. And yet we're just now having this conversation around bias. And so you can't possibly grasp the foundation of this work if you don't even take the time to see the importance of it based on the cultures.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so you are looking at, again, speaking out and speaking up. Your silence will not protect you. And dig a little bit deeper about what happens when we do speak up, right? And what happens when we are, you're looking at the challenge of taking this into a deeper work, not just in practice field, but connecting with the community, connecting with the youth there, and understanding again that history of violence and history of Black and brown children, youth, and women as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, we want to look at the work that you're doing, and it is hands-on. This is from your own experience, which you are bringing into the field of restorative justice and restorative practices. Thank you so much. So we're going to hear again, now going to hear from Rochelle Arms, Almengor, and our chapter is called Women Colorizing Restorative Justice in White-Led Institutions.
Thank you, and it's good to be here. Good evening, and it's good to be in community again with my CRJ family. I think one thing I can say that has been even more rewarding than the process of exploring our individual topics has been just being able to have kinship with each other and kind of an unspoken understanding. And as I was hearing you talk, Barb, I was just thinking of how much we all have shared around these very similar themes. And so much of what you said is just so powerful, right? About how we have been silenced and ignored, and that goes unseen by people who don't experience it, right? Which is why it was so important for us to have this platform. And so I just want to express a lot of gratitude for the opportunity to share our experiences tonight, but for the book in general, and the call for the authors to come forward. Because one thing I've been getting feedback about since the book came out is that there are so many other practitioners out there who share the same experience and who've just been so thirsty to hear that they're not alone. And so often RJ work is very lonely work. You know, we're already working against a cultural grain. And so on top of that, being a Black, brown person, indigenous person, working against a societal grain that isn't aware of the ways in which that oppression has come down through the layers over centuries, and to carry all of that, to protect our clients and carrying that, to try to create safe spaces, but to also carry it ourselves is a lot. So my name's Rochelle Arms Almengor. My last names are representative of my heritage. I have my father is Anglo-American with German and English ancestry, and my mother is mestizo Panamanian with Nobebugle indigenous and Spanish ancestry. And I grew up in Panama until the age of 9, and then we moved to the US to a very white setting when I had grown up in a very indigenous setting in the mountains of Panama. So speaking of code switching, that's also something that's true to my identity, and that because I've taken on higher education and valued that and cared about being able to have the legitimacy behind my name, even if it doesn't really mean anything about true knowledge deep down, but it does open doors. I have had to operate in mostly white spaces. And the reason that I wrote this chapter and why it immediately came to mind when I saw that call for proposals was because I had a realization as I was doing research with restorative justice coordinators in urban intensive high schools, that my own experience, and I've been a practitioner first and foremost. For 20 years, I was working in restorative justice. But looking back on it, I realized, wow, you know, ever since I started in this field, everyone who has supervised me, who has been in charge, was a white person, was a white identifying person. And I realized too, you know, just sort of thinking through my trajectory, that there were opportunities where possibly I could have stepped up into more leadership. But I did not think at those times that I was qualified or worthy. And I think I thought that because I did not see people who looked or sounded like me or thought or felt like me represented. So as much as I could blend, you know, I could blend in and play the role of leaning forward as a woman and speaking out in those sort of traditionally masculine assertive ways that you need to do in meetings to be heard and all that. It wasn't my comfort zone, and it's not how I like to operate. But I realized that those were things that came very naturally to white identifying leaders, and that caused a lot of internal conflict for me to be able to step into those spaces and act in those ways. And so in talking with these other colleagues who are doing the work, and I'm based in New York City, so you know, everybody's is doing work in this highly urban environment, and I would say most people, like Barb is saying, with boots on the ground, are practitioners of color, and many are women practitioners of color. And so the experience of being both a woman and being a person of color is that double intersectionality, right? So there's a number of kind of counts against us when stepping into these spaces where the traditional power is held by white individuals. And we know that predominantly, overwhelmingly, schools, which is what I look at in my chapter, I trace the case studies of 2 women working in high schools, Black women who are doing restorative justice coordination work. And as with most schools, the teachers and the administrators are predominantly white, while the student body is predominantly students of color. So there's already a disconnect that we are trying to insert ourselves into supporting. And I was also in that role. So I was reflecting in this chapter about my own experience in that role, and also working in these nonprofit organizations that, you know, very keen on supporting and I would say selling RJ, because really the way in which organizational leadership often talks about restorative practices in a real marketing kind of way, and this commodification of our practices, I think, is a big reckoning that we need to do. And it's something that I feel that this group really brings forward, is bringing that reckoning to our field, to say, like what Barb was saying, you know, this is not what, this is a sacred practice. And when you put it in a package for selling it and getting the contract, it tears away at that sacred component, and you lose what it was meant to be. So I talk about that. I talk about not just the struggles that women of color experience in their sites that they're assigned to work in, but also the struggles that they experience in their home institutions when their voices are minimized because, for example, speaking, you know, not getting the credit, like what you were saying, Barb, official meetings with people at their sites where their voice was delegitimized, and the person in charge came in from the outside and kind of said how it is without really asking and listening to the person who was doing the front lines work to understand what the day-to-day reality was. Or the disconnect between white practitioners who try to facilitate difficult conversations with young people of color and really don't get it, you know, and can't get it because they haven't had that lived experience of being in a Black or brown body to understand really inherently what it feels like, you know, to be targeted with a racist name, or to be called out as overly sensitive when you respond to sexism or racism and remarks. And schools, as many of us have written about, are just rampant with that kind of disrespect and dishonoring of young people. So, so like all of us, you know, I set out some sort of suggestions about what can be done, and also questions for institutions with white leadership to really ask themselves, to reckon with. If we really want to walk the talk, you know, what do we need to do? And you know, my hope is that this is going to be something that will support other people like me, you know, who I've already been in the field for some time, and I missed some windows of opportunity, maybe. But there are other young people who are entering the field who don't need to go through that, you know, and I think we can all of us in this book and many others who join us who with similar experiences can act as mentors. And my hope is that this can turn into some larger sort of form of mentorship for other colleagues of color who are coming up in RJ and really wanting to be seen and validated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. I'm hearing from you and from Barbara the passion and also the pain of the experiences in many ways, and the desire again to voice your realities, but also to pave the way for other people of color in this field as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that we're already receiving some questions, so continue to put in the question and answer section, questions that are coming to your mind as you're hearing from these authors. We'll now hear from Shamika Mattis as well, and her title of her chapter is called In My Rightful Place.
Thank you, Melody. Good evening or good day to all of you, depending on what time zone you're coming from. I'm so privileged to be here with some of my colleagues and co-authors. It's really good to see faces. We've been working together for a number of years, and like many of you have shared, in terms of how you got here, there's the personal experience, and then there's this calling, which sometimes feels personal, professional, spiritual, but deeply, deeply special. And so I'm a Brooklynite. I'm from New York City. I grew up in a few neighborhoods, Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene, mostly in Fort Greene in the projects, and had to traverse some very interestingly and beautifully different pathways to get to this point today. And so that is probably the first point primarily that is getting me into my rightful place. This idea of feeling like, do I belong? Am I supposed to be here? What's my purpose? You know, who am I owing something to? Who do I have to repay for their service and their stewardship of me, their holding of my trauma, and the trauma that I've caused a lot of people. So I grew up having to be violent, do violence, maybe is a better appropriate way to talk about it. And people held me, shepherded me, guided me, corrected me in these ways, right? So not understanding myself as a BIPOC individual, first and foremost, but then coming into that identity and that awareness and that power, really understood what it looks like when people don't throw you away, who look like you, who sound like you, who want you to know who you are and really whose you are, right? If I'm talking to some of my folks who know about that language, that speak. And so, you know, writing this chapter, I was on the tail end of my time at Common Justice, which is an organization I helped to found. It was started by a greater white project and system that enabled a white woman to, you know, run with the money and do a thing. And she was smart enough to enlist me and a few other people to help found this organization. And so I'm very proud of it, but I also know that it had its limitations, many of which I helped to create because of the models in which, like Rochelle and Barb and Edward have already talked about. You know, we were coming from this very code switching, indoctrinated kind of experience together. And so I wasn't the kind of abolitionist that I am today when I was in that organization or when I first started in it and started it. I wasn't the kind of critical thinker, even though I think I'm a very smart person. I think that I'm a very inquisitive and introspective person, but I wasn't listening to myself the way that I listen to myself today, or that I listen and work within my communities, and not just Black communities, but communities of color, communities across this nation and globally. And so I was rough around the edges, and I wanted to change some things, and I wanted people to know and love themselves. And I attached myself to this, not just organization, but this model after doing prison work and liberation work, after doing work with women who had co-occurring drug and alcohol or other substances, or, you know, had mental health issues, people who were disconnected from their families, children who were being locked up in cages. After doing that work for a number of years, found myself struggling to find a place for myself. And so coming back to New York and Philadelphia to do this work was amazing, because I got to do it in a way that no one had ever done it, at least not in a legal way. right? Working with young people who got to, not be tried as be tried as adults, but not have to suffer adult punishment because of incidences of violence. People who got hurt and didn't have to walk away without having that addressed and having their needs met, whether it was connected to that harm or not. And so being able to tie those things together felt wonderful, but I was still rough around the edges because of some of the things I had to endure in my own work and some of the trauma I was still healing and still am healing, but also because I was also indoctrinated, right? Coming out of white institutions for the most part, being taught that the way that I naturally engage and speak and show up and, wear my clothes and rock the skin that I can't change was somehow, going to create problems for me. So I had to switch it up and I had to, speak the King's English or some nonsense like that. And so, the kind of abolitionist that I am today was where that essay and that chapter got written. I was leaving Common Justice and venturing out into some other things. And, a public defender that I worked with privately sent this to me to say, hey, have you seen this call for authors? And I thought, okay, sure, I'm not writing that. I don't have any time. Why me? I've only been in this game, close to a decade. There are other people who I study under who are my guides and my teachers and my facilitators and my circle keepers. And I know my stuff. I'm like, how can I write something like that? But I sat down and I did it anyway at the urging of my wife. And I'm so glad that I did, because it helped transform me even in the moments of putting the language out there about how I was allowed to hold space. And I really want to echo some of that, which is what some of you have shared. I was given permission to be a circle keeper, just as much as I was in any one social work role or director role or something like that. I was given permission. I was asking for permission. I was allowed to be there, and not by the white people who put me in power, even if they had some misconstrued notion about me being what was it, Barb, you talked about, having to be a disciplinarian as a Black woman, right? Like, even if that was what they were thinking overtly or, covertly, that it was not my role. And so I was speaking power into my community by, and asking for shared power with, right? Not power over, when we were doing these circles together or any of the other organizational pieces. And so the chapter really talks about how I got the privilege to hold space and to be transformed in the process, right? How it looks to prepare one for months and months of a process like this sometimes, because that's how long it can take after years of, enduring a certain harm or not having something answered by the court system in this country, or not being told that you can be creative and implement something brand new. When, trauma can stymie creativity, when the court system certainly says you can't have choice, this kind of program or this kind of effort was helpful to folks, but asking permission nonetheless. And so some of the things that, I'm a teacher, so I write notes. I like to write on the board. I got a pen right here. Some of the things I'm just going to go to because I don't want to belabor any more than I have, but also because some of you said some things that really spoke to me and I had to take some notes, right? To remind myself, like, what was I writing, right? I know what I said. I read my chapter a lot. I passed out my books, but what was I really getting at? And so I want to keep it succinct. So essentially, going back to that creativity, the individual is creative, the system, the systematic ways in which we operate, right? Using innovation within that, right? Not from a human behavior perspective, which talks about it in a deviant way, but innovation in the truest sense of we get to actually craft things together, which means we have to be sharing common language and agreement, right? We have to actually be talking to one another and listening to one another and not listening to respond, listening in nonverbal and verbal, auditory ways, and listening in deep soulful ways so that we can really hear what's being said, because we get to ask what people need and what people want and then get to flip that script when we need to. Understanding my Blackness as not a monolith, talking about how my Blackness is sacred, it is special. My identities, my intersectional identities are all of that, my privilege and my subjugated selves. And it is not automatic licensure or nobility to go and dominate a space. And so this idea that somehow I am more special than my white cohort to come in and be a facilitator or a keeper is not where I live, right? I have more right to be there. But in terms of like doing the work, I got to do the work too, right? So Rochelle talked about walking the talk, doing that, right? Not thinking that I'm special or that I can come in with my own agenda. I have a program to run, or I have a thing to do. I'm interested in peace, right? I'm interested in reconciliation. I believe in people's capacity to rise to their best selves as individuals and as communities. And it's not my agenda, right? So I have to be open to that revision. It is a shared and different experience. I don't care who we are, no matter how much we grew up in the same household, same neighborhood, same country, same tribe, you name it, we are going to have different experiences and need to be able to talk about that and have space to talk about that so that we don't assume, right? Like one of the 4 agreements is don't make assumptions, so that we can not make assumptions about your experience is just like mine and feel like, you know, somehow then it doesn't give me license to listen or speak or show up. This idea of being a steward, right? Giving service to people in a circle keeping way, that's about trauma stewardship, first and foremost, as a social worker. As a person who grew up in a faithful religious tradition, right? Christianity and some other things. You know, understanding that my stewardship, right, is not for something to be reciprocated to me. My stewardship is what I pay on this earth for my time on this earth, right? And healing as part of that stewardship. So if there is some reciprocity, it is that I do the work myself, that I am healing and tending myself and allowing people to check me, to hold me accountable, right? And accountability is, this is what I did, this is what I'm gonna do, this is what you said you were gonna do, are we doing it? I can't do it, help me out, can we do it next time? That's accountability. That is not punishment and reward like the systemic oppression of white supremacy in this country. So the relearning, right, is the other piece of that. Relearning after being indoctrinated, enmeshed, right, overpowered by white supremacist settler culture. So speaking to my native pieces that are in my blood, my Black pieces that are in my blood, and whatever else makes me up, and speaking to that and relearning what it is to think critically, relearning what it is to listen with my heart, relearning what it is to not have an agenda, relearning what it is to be able to, you know, hold space and say, we don't know, right? And live in that and feel comfortable in that by honoring, first and foremost, indigenous people of this land, right? By honoring BIPOC people from this place globally, right? And saying, hey, this is a space that was already here. We didn't come and create this. This existed before us. And then understanding that within that, there is no hierarchy, which means I shouldn't be taking credit. So the largest gripe that I had with some of my white co-facilitators or co-circle keepers or other organization directors and people like Barb talked about in these meetings is that they thought they owned something, right? They thought they had created the best thing. These institutes and these organizations are named for people. Books are written by these folks thinking, oh, well, you know, I created the model. So I'm first and best, or I'm the only, right? So listening to that and saying, no, there is no hierarchy. You don't get credit. We're not a competition, right? We are not diametrically opposed. And so how can we have that as a model and then think that that's not going to seep into what we're doing when we're talking about addressing harm or addressing culture or addressing how people can communicate? Affirming people, being affirmed in that, affirming people deeply, not on some superficial level, right? Reclaiming, right? Returning to our original place and reclaiming that. That's why I said yes to this when, you know, my colleague reached out to me and said, hey, I think you should contribute. And questioning myself and always examining, right? Am I not doing enough, right? I don't think that the human condition is ever pleased with, are we doing enough? I don't think that's an answerable thing. But am I doing this and am I doing this above board, right? Are people able to see me and check me? Because this is not, like so many of you have already shared in your chapters and in person tonight, this is not behavior modification. This is not something that should be mandated, right? To try and have a code name for some other kind of discipline or control, social control. This is something that is not about whitewashing. This is not something for assimilation. This is something that is not to maintain systems of oppression. This is something to free people up. And so I listen to all of you, and I just want to honor that before I shut up, which is that for me, what I heard tonight thus far is that what CRJ, Colorizing Restorative Justice is necessary, it's communal, it's collective, it's indigenous, it's abolitionist, it's anti-racist inherently. It is me, it is you, it is intersectional. And what it is not is, it is not covert. It is not in service of whiteness. It is not in service to power over, and it is not to maintain the status quo. So I thank you for listening to me right now. And for those of you who have the book, will get the book. I'm definitely with my sister Barb about, you know, speaking up, because you got to raise hell wherever you are. And sometimes you're going to get blessed for that. And other times you're going to get, you know, get some more work to do and get some haters. But it's all right. We got haters whether we speak up or not. So might as well speak up. And I'm glad to be here with all of you tonight.
Ashe, Ashe. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shameeka. And, these themes of speaking up, these themes of, again, taking care of yourself and honoring the work and the process as well, and the foundation that we are building upon and returning to, if you will. Right. I think of this St. Sankofa, returning to, looking back in order to move forward as we're paving the way. So we're going to continue on hearing from our wonderful authors as well. And so we next have Johanna Turner, Dr. Johanna Turner, Creating Safety for Ourselves. Creating Safety for Ourselves is the title of her chapter.
Thanks so much, Melody. First, I just have to say, for my own tradition, amen
Yeah.
to Shameeka, and to thank you for that. That was powerful. And also to all of you who spoke already, Barb and Rochelle and Edward. I know we're going to be coming back to you also. I want to actually say something before I start talking about my chapter, about something that, Rochelle, you said about mentorship. I want to express so much gratitude to you, Edward, for the ways in which you have helped me to understand a book project like this as a form of mentorship. I think that the way that you created an opportunity, right, that you facilitated kind of the contributions and this opportunity for us to not only to write what we did, but to also, you facilitated and continue to facilitate conversations in which we're getting together and then also inviting others in. And I also want to name how important it has been to me, not only your research and your work for the sovereignty and liberation of indigenous people, your rooting in your homeland, the Great Sioux Nation, all of these things that you also have brought to this project have been incredibly important to me in terms of why I said yes to participating. So that's my prelude. For my chapter is in many ways, I think it is. In some ways, I think the chapters we've talked about operate as a call and a response, right? Which is so much a part of our traditions, a call and a response. So whereas kind of, Barb and Rochelle, you all are naming issues with white supremacy in this movement in this field. And I think that in some ways, Shameeka and I's chapters kind of operated in the second half of the book as a response in saying, Shameeka, you talk about in your chapter, these are some of the things that I'm doing, when I'm holding circle. I start with naming some of the cultural roots for the people who are in the circle. And I start by talking about the structural components and the systems that are related to the individual harms that brought us here. And so, that's kind of one response, right? And so my chapter is another kind of response. And it came from conversations, particularly with kind of two different overlapping groups, conversations with my graduate students in the program where I teach at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University, many of whom are restorative justice practitioners and already were doing that work before they came to join a master's program. And then other people in the restorative justice movement, conversations about a lack of systemic and structural analysis around race and gender and class and other dimensions of identity and systems of power. And, talking about this lack of analysis and how it connects to kind of needing to talk about not only interpersonal harm, but really state-sponsored violence and structural violence. And so the response that I had was, and while there is a body of grassroots work that is doing that, grassroots restorative justice practice, the scholarship that we have and a lot of the resources we have in restorative justice, that's not institutionalized as part of it. And yet there is a robust body of analysis, right, that has done that, right, already, 20 years of it, in fact, if not more. And that work has been lodged in, or has been situated in, a related movement called transformative justice, the transformative justice and community accountability movement. And so what I was really wanting to do with my chapter is to say that so much of the analysis that many of us have held and are a part of because of the movements that we're rooted in. So much of that analysis has been developed and shaped and has been shared and continues to be shared by folks who are especially grounded in the transformative justice and community accountability movement. And I wanted to really use the chapter as a way to further dialogue, among many people who of course locate themselves in both movements, but many restorative justice practitioners of color in particular who are not aware that this robust body of analysis and writing exists and this robust body of practice exists, right? And to be able to say that it resonates and it reflects some of the things that we have been needing and wanting. So my chapter, in a nutshell, it describes the principles, analysis, and practices at the center of the contemporary transformative justice and community accountability movement. And I actually just want to read a little bit of the introduction and then say a little bit more about that. I say on the first page, this chapter tells how people of color, particularly women of color and queer and trans people of color in this generation, are creating safety without relying on a violent and oppressive criminal legal system. I first became aware of these efforts more than 10 years ago as a young activist and artist involved in juvenile justice organizing and the prison abolition movement. And it was particularly through my participation in the Washington, DC chapter. I was in DC for many years. I grew up around the DC area and then was living in DC for a few years as well. And I was a part of the DC chapter of what was then Insight Women of Color Against Violence, is now Insight Women, Trans and Gender Nonconforming People of Color Against Violence, or just Insight for short. This organization that has been played such a foundational role of radical feminists of color, doing work at the intersections, naming the intersections of state violence and gender violence, naming the intersections of so many systems of oppression that impact our experiences of harm, right? And that so much of that analysis and practice has shaped me and shaped what I brought to restorative justice and my teaching of it. But it was difficult for me when I was looking at the resources that I had before me and kind of the existing text to bring some of what I learned and what shaped me and what formed me to my teaching. And so part of what writing this chapter has also done for me, it has helped me to return to some of those teachings for me, and also to deepen my understanding of what's going on now as I've been disconnected from it. And another, thing that I really wanted to do in the chapter is to, again, name some of the connections. And so there's this question that I asked that I actually learned from really a lot of this language and this question from Miriam Kaba, who, and the question that I ask is, how can transformative justice help us to develop or to deepen the liberatory potential of restorative justice? So that idea of the liberatory potential of restorative justice is something that I got that language from Miriam Kaba. And basically what I talk about, and this is also kind of a section that I'll just name, I'll read, this is on page 311 of the book. I say that the underlying analysis, actually I want to start a little bit earlier. I say transformative justice, actually, you know what? I'm going to actually start earlier. Legal scholar, so this is a really great, Angela Harris, she is a legal scholar, critical race feminist, and I read this article that she wrote in which she talks about how she names transformative justice as an ideal that resembles restorative justice, but it's infused with the politics and principles of critical race feminism. And that just made so much sense to me. This article is actually available freely online. It's a book review essay that she does. It's called Beyond the Monster Factory, Race, Gender, and the Liberatory Potential of Restorative Justice. I think that's the rest of the name. But anyway, I say transformative justice is wholly grounded in a politics of liberation, right? It acknowledges intersecting systems of oppression. It seeks to transform them on multiple levels. And I go on to say that it resonates with my lived experiences as a Black woman, follower of Jesus, prison abolitionist, and sexual abuse survivor. And then I talk about how the underlying analysis of transformative justice, which is the sister movement, illuminates many of the perspectives that many restorative justice practitioners of color already hold. And so because of that, I think it can support our articulation of a broader analysis and vision for restorative justice. So those are some of the things that I really wanted to name in this chapter and to really facilitate some more of that bridge building and connection that can further movement building on a broader level. I think I'll stop there.
Fabulous. This is really expanding the conversation. You are bringing these perspectives and different voices to, again, the field. And so this is exciting. You are, again, showing up in all that you are and expanding the field and expanding it through your experiences and connecting in other aspects of, again, you said transformative justice, as well. So thank you so much, Johanna, for that. And then the last person that we'll hear from, again, of course, is one of our editors, Edward Valandra, again, Undoing the First Harm, Settlers in Restorative Justice, will bring it forth for us at this time. Thank you. You're on mute right now, so. There you go.
Okay. I was just saying, wow, my feet are stomping every time I hear my gentle sisters talk about their chapters. You know, they are true warriors in a sense, because they speak a lot of what comes from the heart. I just want to mention that as the editor, when I read the manuscripts of all the contributors, it really excited me and it did overwhelm me. And to have the opportunity to be on these various panels, it's more than I ever dreamed. I couldn't wait for the book to come out so the contributors could get the book and read everyone else's chapters. And I really think there's a lot of good messaging in CRJ. And so this has gone beyond even my fondest hopes of we share what we're doing. And I was so excited when the book finally came out and everyone could get copies and read what everyone else is saying. We're just adding so much momentum to what the current state of restorative justice, restorative practice is within the racial climate of a violent settler state like the US and Canada as well. So I would even argue that the CRJ is actually a movement now, because we have broken the barrier of silence, as we've heard. We've broken the barrier of invisibility. And so now I think we're really moving forward. And I would say CRJ, it is a real thing. It's not only theoretical or conceptual, but it's also boots on the ground, frontline action. So I just wanted to say that, and I'm very excited, and I'm always smiling when I hear my gentle sisters and brothers talk about their chapters and their experiences. You can get some idea of how some of our Zoom discussions were, and my gentle sisters didn't disappoint me. When we have a Zoom discussion like this between ourselves, they really speak with such passion. So settlers, undoing the first harm, it's been my experience that within restorative justice and restorative practice, there's always been homage paid to indigenous peoples, you know, the circle, talking piece, and these kind of things. But as an indigenous person, when I went into the circles, particularly among, as we talked about, among whites, I often heard the rhetoric that, you know, one of the core things about restorative justice and restorative practices is to undo or to address harms as a result of wrongdoing. And I remember sitting in some of the mostly white circles and thinking, how can you even talk about undoing harms when the first harm, that is the theft of our land and the genocide of my people, our indigenous people, has not even been discussed? Where is the moral compass in that? How can you even begin to talk about that? And then we can talk about the harms of slavery as another harm. And so I've never, you know, contrary to what we read in the literature, a lot of times, that just because you have a circle and you have established protocols and values doesn't mean I feel safe as an indigenous person, particularly when I'm among settlers. Really brought it to the core for me. Like, I want restorative justice and restorative practice, transformative justice, even to have a lot of meaning and purpose to it. And I just don't want to sit in a circle and feel good about discussing maybe things that might feel good to maybe a settler. But for me as an indigenous person, I want the first harm to be addressed. I want the first harm to be undone. And until restorative justice and restorative practices actually deal with that issue, I feel as an indigenous person that restorative justice will never reach the potential that it has. And I think in other communities of color, they may feel the same way as well. I mean, it's systemic, it is structural, but I have to struggle with that. And I very rarely go into circles anymore, because I think there needs to be a lot more self-accountability that has to be done, particularly by settlers. You know, we just had recently, we had the American president come into my homelands where Mount Rushmore was. And the reportage was that, well, here are all these Lakota people protesting. And the narrative was, no, we are still protecting our homelands from settler invasion. And so the narrative gets to say, well, there are all these protesters, they're indigenous. And I'm saying they are not protesters. We are protectors of our homeland. And because we had the president of the United States who never asked for our consent to even come into our homelands, that's typical settler behavior. And I have a really good friend who once gave me a test to give to settlers. And that test is this: what is the first thing you do when you step out of bed in the morning? And when I put that to settlers, they say, well, I run, I brush my teeth, I pray, I read, I shower. And I say, no, the first thing you do in the morning when you step out of bed is you step on stolen native land. That's the first thing you do. And when I hear, and so when I challenge settlers to think about that, that's a deep meditation. And the response is, I never think about that. Exactly. You never think. The first thing you do when you get out of bed is you step on stolen native land and all the harms that come from that. So as a settler, I always put this out to them, as a settler, how do you think indigenous peoples feel when we sit in your circles and you don't even discuss the first harm? And that became a real deep dive issue for me. And how can you feel safe? Because there is backlash to that. There's a thing, you know, we've heard of white fragility. Well, let me tell you, there's a thing called settler fragility too. And only indigenous peoples can walk into a room and ask about land return. And settlers always flip that narrative. They say, what, give land back? And we say, no, you can never give whatever belonged to you. You can only return stolen property. and stealing is still a crime in this country. So when I try to speak that kind of truth in circles, it gets very risky, because settlers are not only white, they're people of color too. And how do we negotiate that with my brothers and sisters? So that's why I wrote that chapter. I'm saying we have to really address these harms, these initial harms, these harms of Genesis. You know, the theft of native land and the theft of the indigenous Africans' labor. That to me is some of the harms that are so systemic. And it's probably something that a lot of people don't think about because there's so many other harms, you know, structural and systemic in this country. But I really wanted to write that. And let me tell you, I think every one of the contributors that wrote a chapter for this book, I really have to praise them because we take a certain amount of risks writing and being so open. We open ourselves up to other harms that may come our way. And I really think that is something that I think I need to acknowledge for those that have wrote in this book, that there is some risk to being very upfront and being very honest. And we've all experienced that to some degree or another, but even more now because we've opened up that discussion and we provided a space for many others to weigh in on that. But, you know, as far as, and that was it. When we have settlers and restorative justice, what does that really mean? Some of the settlers and restorative justice are leaders of the movement, and they're very silent about these harms that I bring: the theft of land, the genocide, the theft of African indigenous labor. To me, those are just very core and fundamental issues that restorative justice and restorative practices have to embrace in order for communities to begin to heal. And that's going to be a very difficult conversation. It is very much of a conversation out in my part of the homelands, particularly where we have a lot of settlers. But that's what motivated me. I wanted to bring that issue because, you know, there are not a lot of indigenous people in restorative justice, although we practice it as a way of life in our homelands. And I think indigenous peoples have a lot to say about restorative justice beyond just the tokenism. We want to bring love into the circle. We want to bring, and I've heard my general sisters talk about that. I want to reach out to the Black and brown brothers and sisters and have an authentic dialogue. I'm not so sure if I really want that with whites at this point. I want to know more about, you know, we all experience oppression, but we also, it's common to us, but we're also so unique that we can learn so much from each other. And I have learned much being the editor of this book. It makes me want to embrace all the authors and the contributors, and it wants me to go out and embrace even more of the communities of color, to say, you know what, this is a spiritual movement, and this is a movement that requires a lot of self-reflection and a lot of self-accountability. So I want to decolonize restorative justice in a way that reflects us, who we are as peoples. The spiritual aspects, I've heard that. I love that part of it. Also, you know, who are we? What are we doing? How are we moving forward? I feel a real passion for that. And I just want to just keep moving this conversation forward because the times call for it, you know, so I caught the spirit from the previous speakers, and thank you. I'm actually shaking a little bit here, but they encouraged me to speak so openly and honestly, and I want to thank all my gentle sisters for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Your words are just so powerful in that way, in the sharing. You talk about these twin wounds and this genocide and slavery, and in your chapter, it kind of sums it up on this end as well. You quote Alice Walker, right, saying healing begins where the wounds were made. And this is such an opportunity for healing to begin, and so we want to go into, with the time that we have left, we do want to hear from the audience as far as your questions. I know that our authors have shared so much from their heart. They have shared their passion, they've taken a risk, and they also have lifted up these realities that are so important to continue the discussion. So today is just a beginning of discussion, a beginning of the healing processes, and also getting a deeper understanding of what is happening in the field of restorative justice. And so we do have some questions from our audience, and I will look at that as well. And so we have a first question a question here for Rochelle is, do you believe that a facilitator needs to share identity with the students they are facilitating? Right. So the question is looking at racial identity, and is that something that should be considered case by case, or is it a consistent limiting factor? So again, looking at, I think some of your discussion was, sharing was looking at perhaps white practitioners working with youth of color as well.
Thank you, Melody. I also just want to flag that I think there was a previous question for Barb, and so I don't know if I'm happy to answer this, but I just want to make sure we don't skip for that one.
I won't miss that one.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so I guess, thank you for the question. I think I would put it a little bit more broadly. You know, I think oftentimes when we hear problems, you know, our knee-jerk response is that we want to figure out, well, what's the formula so that we can fix it? And what are the steps so we can make it right, and then, you know, make sure we're good. And I would, you know, I'm not suggesting that that's where your question is coming from, but just as a general observation that I found, especially in spaces where we do this work where time is of the essence and people are overstretched and overworked, often the wish is to just kind of have some concrete plan and do X, Y, and Z. So I guess I would encourage you, I guess, Anna, to think of it maybe more broadly in terms of not so much placing a person of color or a racially, you know, complementary person with a circle or with a group that you're doing work with, because I think that sort of mentality can easily get us into the realm of tokenism, which is already a problem that we're facing as practitioners of color, and especially my Black sisters, you know, is being called into spaces in order to make sure that there's a person who looks like the people who are in the room, and you can cover your bases in that way, meanwhile, you know, with these other internal goings on, which is what I write about in the chapter in the organization, that person is minimized, or their ideas are not taken as seriously, or like Barb was saying, they're made to play these particular traditional and stereotypical roles. So I would think of it more broadly in terms of, and I'm sorry, there's a train next to my house that's about to go by, so you're gonna maybe hear it whistle. But I would think about it in terms of what does our whole field need to look like, right? Who needs to be, why is it that where half of our young people in schools are students of color, 80% of teachers are white? So rather than think about how let's put a black teacher in this space to work with these black students, let's think about it, you know, in the terms that Johanna was talking about, with the transformative justice kind of mentality, where we need to think about the bigger system. And when Edward was talking, I was thinking about a question that comes up so much for me, and the people that I'm working with. I'm working with restorative justice practitioners who are doing participatory action research together right now. We're looking at how trauma intergenerational trauma affects our work. And one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, where does the harm live? So when we enter a space, a circle, or any other kind of restorative process, what we are naming as the harm kicks off a whole series of things as to how we address the situation at hand. And if we are thinking, as restorative justice has, I think, so often done and needs to improve on, if we're thinking of the harm as the immediate interaction, and, you know, whether it's a fight or a conflict between people, and we're not remembering that we live in a whole system, like so many others have said, that is inflicting harm on us every day, including not having addressed those first harms that Edward was talking about, then we have kind of missed the point in a way. So I say all that to answer your question in this kind of bigger way, and to give it a wider view, that it's not so much about inserting people of color into these spaces to make sure that we have, you know, the boxes checked, but more that we look at why there is a need to do that, and like, why is that even a desire in the first place? And shouldn't there be practitioners in all these spaces, including leadership spaces, who reflect the communities in which we work?
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for answering that question. And then to Barbara, yes. Barbara, how were you received after speaking up? And have you seen things change since then, systematically as well?
How am I received after speaking up? Most people, especially keeping it all the way honest, like most white people, men, women, gender non-conforming, no one likes an outspoken, assertive, passionate Black woman. No one likes a Black woman who says, yes, I am angry, and rightfully so, because I recognize the injustice that's happening to me and my people. So, you know, coming to terms, right, surrendering to the fact that, you know, as Audre Lorde has said, you know, sharing my time, you know, no longer swallowing my tyrannies day in and day out. A mantra that has come from that is like, this world is not my burden to carry. And being in a space where having a white colleague who was my supervisor weaponizing this work, not only towards the schools that we were in partnership with, or the organization we were in partnership with, but also me and other Black women within my organization, it was like, this is literally life or death for us. And so we don't have time, you know, to think about the kind, the nice, let me not say kind, because kind means radical honesty, but the nice way, the soft way to call white folks in when speaking up, or how do I say this and articulate it in this way, when, to be quite honest, it may be more, what's the word that I'm looking for? In the moment, it may be more appropriate, right, to speak in my native tongue, to use my African-American vernacular, because whatever it is that I'm saying in that moment, expression, that is what's most powerful for me. And it's your work, right, to figure it out, especially coming into this work. One thing that I've always appreciated about Dr. Valandra saying is that recognizing for settlers, for colonizers, that you are a guest in this work. Right. So it's saying that, knowing like, here is this boundary. And so we need to figure out how we work around this boundary and how we come to this so we can be in community. Have I seen things change since then? No. Right. Short answer, no. We're looking at the current state of society. No, I have not. And Johonna touched on it as well when we talk about transformative justice. I engage in restorative practices, restorative justice, using from a place of womanism, womanist theology, Alice Walker's work, Audre Lorde, Ntozake Shange, all of the work I study thoroughly and really understand and see the parallels, even the connections between restorative justice and womanism. And so knowing that, not engaging in disposability, that means that we have to look at systems, we have to look at how they influence folks. And so when we see this work even as diversion, and I'm calling my own organization out, right? Because this is the battle that we're in, right? Like doing this work authentically, and then saying, how do we make sure that our brothers and sisters in our family inside are still safe? How can we make sure that they still have access to a process that guarantees them their dignity and humanity, right? And so in doing all that, being able to say, here's how we're going to hold space, and this is something that we cannot move on. And so in that, it's hard, right, to see the system change, because the things that are required for the system, we can't reform it. We can't change it, right? If we're talking about using this process with fidelity, we need a total defunding, and to be quite honest, abolishing, right? I think at this point, right, as a Black woman, it's, womanist and circle keeper, understanding that the only way that we're going to get to a place where we can move past the harms that happens is if we return the land. If we talk about the bodies that have been stolen, how do we start the process of giving those bodies dignity and humanity, right? How do we start to address those things? How do we start to create this society where education is seen as an exchange and not as a banking system? How do we start to define justice where it doesn't just include the definition of justice from settlers and colonizers, right? So I don't want to keep going, because I know I want to make sure I give my other colleagues time, but no, I have not seen things systemically change, even in doing policy work in Maryland, and folks declaring, we got to make sure we talk about race. We got to make sure we talk about race, and incorporating it in the problem, right, in such a research way, but then going to solutions and seeing that there's no call for anti-racism within higher education and teacher preparation programming. Seeing that there's no call for us to take a look at at our state handbook, at our school district handbooks, and looking and seeing, what are the ways in which we're upholding white supremacist, colonial, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy, in relationship building ways and reactive ways. Like, look at the ways in which not our children are funneled into the prison system through education, but also parents through bullshit rules, excuse my French, right? Like truancy court, right? When we know that capitalism demands, especially those who are poor and working people of color, to be in working spaces where they're exploited for their labor. So no, not seeing things change.
Yes, the answer, no. There's still more work to do, and we will do the work our soul must have, right? Katie Cannon, womanist, theologian. This is so rich, and of course, I wish we had so much more time, but discussions will continue as you read the book, as you work with your mentors, and so many other ways that we can continue this conversation. I will ask if you would stay just a few more minutes. We're just going to have some closing announcements from the Zehr Institute, and I will close our time today. And so I turn it over to Maggie at this time.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Just a couple of announcements. The first is that I hope you join us as we continue these conversations about restorative justice and anti-racism. at our upcoming webinars on October 21st, November 18th, and December 16th. You can visit Zehr-Institute.org to register. Next, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR program, is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. This fall, the STAR trainings will be online. STAR 1 meets Wednesdays and Fridays from September 23rd to November 13th, and STAR 2 will meet Tuesdays and Fridays from October 20th to December 11th. You can visit emu.edu/cjp/star to register. If you're interested in learning more about restorative justice, we have several opportunities for you to study at Eastern Mennonite University through graduate degrees and certificates, such as the RJ Graduate Certificate, which is perfect for working professionals. EMU also offers studies that combine RJ and education, or RJE. Students pursuing a master's in education can get a restorative justice and education concentration, or similar to the previous slide, graduate certificates are also available for those interested in RJE. There are also master's degrees in conflict transformation, restorative justice, and the newly added program for transformational leadership. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners within their chosen field. For more information, visit emu.edu/cjp/grad. And last but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, the schedule of upcoming webinars, and a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. Thank you so much. That concludes my announcements. So here is Melody with a few closing comments.
Thank you so much again for everyone being here today, this evening. I know that you have so many more questions and things to discuss, and we encourage you to, of course, purchase the book and also to engage in your community, in your institutions, in your families, in your neighborhoods with these questions that you have, and with this the discussion and the issues that were raised tonight. I hope that you take that in as well. And so just from, again, reading from the foreword of Colorizing Restorative Justice, peacemaking is the people's process. And surely we are in process. We are in transition. We are in healing as we continue to go back, to go forward. And Chief Manuelito said, wherever you go, don't ever come out of your traditional way of life, your prayers, your songs, your culture, and your language. We honor you, and we thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the editors, the authors, and the participants. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. Have a very good night. Peace.